The summer heat was at its peak when Jake Thompson stood in his spacious backyard, wiping sweat from his forehead as he envisioned the perfect spot for his dream project. At 35, the dedicated physical therapist had spent the last 5 years building his career and finally purchased his first home in the prestigious Pine Grove community, a decision that seemed perfect until this moment of conflict began brewing. Jake's interest in saunas wasn't just a random hobby. Working with patients all day had taught him the incredible benefits of heat therapy for muscle recovery and stress relief. Every weekend, he would drive 30 minutes to the nearest spa, spending a small fortune on sauna sessions. It was during one of these relaxing moments that the idea struck him: why not build his own? For 3 months straight, Jake immersed himself in research. His dining room table disappeared under stacks of sauna designs, material catalogs, and local building codes. He wasn't taking any chances, especially since he lived in an HOA-controlled community. The Pine Grove Homeowners Association was known for its strict regulations, but Jake was determined to do everything by the book. One particular Saturday morning, Jake pulled out the thick HOA guidelines manual he received when purchasing his home. He spent hours highlighting relevant sections about outdoor structures, taking detailed notes, and even creating a spreadsheet to ensure compliance. The manual mentioned nothing specifically about saunas, but it did have clear guidelines about permanent structures, which Jake carefully considered. With his savings account healthy from years of careful budgeting, Jake started reaching out to contractors. He chose a local company, Mountain Cedar Works, known for their craftsmanship in building outdoor structures. The owner, Bill Martinez, had 20 years of experience and immediately understood Jake's vision for an 8x8-seater sauna that would complement his home's architecture. The permit process was next. Jake visited the city planning office multiple times, filling out every required form and submitting detailed blueprints. He even took an extra step by having an electrical inspector review his plans, since the sauna would require power. After 6 weeks of paperwork and revisions, Jake finally held the approved permits in his hands. Construction began in early summer. Bill and his team worked efficiently, and Jake found himself spending every free moment watching the sauna take shape. The cedar walls rose beautifully against the backdrop of his yard, and the structure's clean lines matched perfectly with his home's modern aesthetic. The project cost him $12,000, a significant investment, but Jake considered it worthwhile for something he would use almost daily. The finishing touches were Jake's favorite part. He carefully selected the interior benches, choosing a 2-tier design that could comfortably seat 4 people. The electric heater was top of the line, featuring digital controls and safety shoot-off features. Small, weather-resistant windows were installed to provide natural light while maintaining privacy. Every detail was thoughtfully planned and executed. As summer drew to a close, Jake's dream became reality. The sauna stood proudly in his backyard, its cedar exterior aging beautifully in the sunlight. He hosted a small gathering for his closest friends to celebrate the completion, and everyone praised both the craftsmanship and his attention to detail. Even his neighbors seemed impressed, with several asking for information about building their own. Jake established a routine of using the sauna every evening after work. The daily sessions helped ease the physical strain from his job and provided a peaceful space for meditation. He even started inviting some of his chronic pain patients to try sessions, seeing remarkable improvements in their conditions. The sauna became more than just a luxury. It was a therapeutic tool that enhanced both his personal life and professional practice. Little did Jake know that his pride and joy would become the center of an unexpected battle. Despite his careful planning and adherence to regulations, storm clouds were gathering in the form of HOA bureaucracy. The peaceful evenings in his beloved sauna were numbered, though he had no way of knowing that his careful documentation and research would eventually prove to be his strongest weapons in the fight ahead. For now, Jake continued his evening routine, completely unaware that this cherished addition to his home would soon become the catalyst for a neighborhood controversy that would change not just his life, but the entire community's approach to homeowner rights. October 14th started like any other Thursday for Jake Thompson. He had spent the morning at his physical therapy clinic, helping patients recover from various injuries, completely unaware that his own world was about to be turned upside down. The autumn weather had been perfect for his evening sauna sessions, and he was looking forward to unwinding after a particularly busy day. Turning onto Pine Grove Lane, Jake noticed an unusual amount of activity near his house. A large yellow bulldozer was parked on the street, and several people in reflective vests were walking around his property. His heart rate quickened as he pulled into his driveway, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he rushed to his backyard. Where his beautiful cedar sauna had stood just hours ago, there was nothing but disturbed earth and scattered debris. The $12,000 structure that he had meticulously planned and built had been reduced to a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. Jake stood frozen, his work bag sliding off his shoulder and hitting the ground with a thud that he barely registered. A piece of paper fluttered in the breeze, taped to his back door. With trembling hands, Jake retrieved the notice. The letterhead displayed the Pine Grove HOA logo, and the contents made his blood run cold. Notice of unauthorized structure removal. Violation of Community Guidelines Section 7.3. The notice was signed by Victoria Winters, the HOA board president, with a timestamp of 11:30 a.m. that same day. Jake's mind raced through all his careful preparation, the permits, the guidelines he'd studied, the approvals he thought he'd secured. He immediately pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the destruction, his hands shaking so badly he had to retake several shots. The demolition crew was already packing up their equipment, avoiding eye contact as Jake approached them for answers. "Just following orders, sir," the crew foreman muttered, handing Jake a business card for the demolition company. "You'll need to take it up with the HOA board. We were told this was an unauthorized structure that needed immediate removal." Inside his house, Jake pulled out the thick folder of documentation he'd maintained throughout the construction process. Every email, every permit, every receipt was carefully organized and dated. He had even taken photographs of each construction phase. As he reviewed the materials, his initial shock began to transform into calculated anger. Neighbors started appearing at his fence, drawn by the commotion. Mary Chen, the retired teacher from next door who had often complimented his sauna, stood with her hand over her mouth in disbelief. "Jake, I saw them come in this morning," she said, her voice filled with concern. "They didn't even try to contact you. I thought surely you knew about this." Jake's phone started buzzing with text messages from other neighbors who had witnessed the demolition. Someone had taken video of the bulldozer tearing through the cedar walls, and the footage made Jake's stomach turn. The careful craftsmanship of Bill Martinez and his team, destroyed in minutes without warning or consultation. Trying to maintain his composure, Jake called the HOA office. The receptionist informed him that Victoria Winters was in meetings and unavailable. He left an urgent message, then called Bill Martinez to inform him of what had happened. Bill was outraged, immediately offering to provide any documentation needed to fight back against the HOA's actions. That evening, Jake couldn't bring himself to eat dinner. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers, reading and rereading the HOA guidelines. Section 7.3, which the notice had cited, dealt with temporary structures like tool sheds and children's playhouses. His sauna, a permanent structure with a concrete foundation and approved electrical work, clearly didn't fall into this category. As darkness fell, Jake stood in his backyard, staring at the empty space where his sauna had stood. The evening air felt colder without the promise of a warm, relaxing session in his cedar haven. But amid his anger and disappointment, a determination began to grow. He had followed every rule, documented every step, and secured every required approval. The HOA had made a serious mistake, and Jake decided at that moment that they would have to answer for it. Little did the HOA board know, their rash action would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge their authority and change the dynamics of the entire community. Jake Thompson, the quiet physical therapist who had always played by the rules, was about to show them exactly what happened when they chose the wrong homeowner to bully. The Pine Grove HOA board met every third Wednesday of the month in the community center's main hall. As Jake Thompson walked into the October meeting, he immediately noticed the tension in the room. Jake had spent the week preparing for this confrontation. Dressed in a crisp blue button-down shirt and carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents, he projected calm professionalism despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Several neighbors nodded encouragingly as he took a seat in the front row. Victoria Winters, the HOA board president, called the meeting to order at exactly 7:00 p.m. She was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had ruled the board with an iron fist for the past 5 years. The agenda listed unauthorized structure removal, 1542 Pine Grove Lane, as the last item, clearly hoping to wear down the audience with mundane business first. For 2 hours, Jake sat patiently through discussions about lawn maintenance schedules and parking violations. He used the time to observe the board members' dynamics. Besides Victoria, there was Tom Peterson, a retired accountant who kept checking his watch, Susan Martinez, who seemed uncomfortable with the large crowd, and 2 newer members who barely spoke. Finally, Victoria announced Jake's agenda item. Mr. Thompson, you have 5 minutes to address the board regarding the structure removal at your property, she stated, her voice clipped and dismissive. Jake stood, straightened his papers, and began speaking in a clear, measured tone. Last Thursday, without any prior notice or hearing, this board authorized the destruction of my fully permitted, legally constructed sauna. I have copies of all relevant documentation, including city permits, electrical inspections, and architectural drawings. He proceeded to distribute packets to each board member, watching as their expressions shifted from boredom to concern as they flipped through the pages. The notice cited Section 7.3 of our community guidelines regarding temporary structures. My sauna was a permanent structure with a concrete foundation, approved electrical work, and full compliance with all building codes. Victoria attempted to interrupt, but Jake continued firmly. I invested $12,000 in this project. I followed every regulation, submitted every required document, and received all necessary approvals. The board's actions were not only unjustified but potentially illegal. The room had grown completely silent. Even Tom Peterson had stopped checking his watch. Furthermore, Jake continued, I have statements from multiple neighbors who witnessed the demolition, including video footage. No attempt was made to contact me before or during the destruction of my property. I demand full compensation for the sauna, plus additional damages for this egregious violation of my property rights. Victoria's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Mr. Thompson, while we appreciate your thoroughness, the board's decision was based on multiple complaints about the structure's appearance and its impact on neighborhood property values. What complaints? Jake challenged. I request copies of all documented complaints and the minutes of the board meeting where this decision was made. Susan Martinez shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't recall any formal complaints being filed, she admitted, earning a sharp glare from Victoria. Several neighbors began speaking up from the audience. Mary Chen stood and addressed the board directly. That sauna was beautifully built and matched Jake's house perfectly. Who complained? Because I never heard anyone say anything negative about it. The meeting devolved into chaos as more residents voiced their support for Jake. Victoria repeatedly banged her gavel, trying to restore order, but the momentum had shifted. Tom Peterson finally spoke up, his accountant's precision evident in his words. I move that we table this discussion pending legal review of our actions. It appears there may have been some procedural oversights. Victoria had no choice but to agree, but her parting words to Jake carried a clear threat. The board will review your documentation and respond accordingly. However, Mr. Thompson, I remind you that challenging HOA decisions can be a lengthy and expensive process. Jake gathered his materials, thanked the residents who had supported him, and walked out of the meeting with his head held high. In the parking lot, Mary Chen and several other neighbors gathered around him. This isn't right, Jake, Mary said firmly. We're behind you on this. Victoria's gone too far this time. Jake nodded, already formulating his next steps. The HOA board had clearly expected him to accept their decision quietly. Their mistake was about to become very expensive, both financially and politically. The battle had just begun, and Jake Thompson was proving to be an opponent they had severely underestimated. Sleep eluded Jake Thompson in the days following the contentious HOA meeting. His nights became a blur of legal websites, property rights forums, and endless cups of coffee. His dining room transformed into a makeshift law library, with printouts of state statutes and court cases covering every surface. On his third sleepless night, at 2:47 a.m., Jake discovered something that made him sit up straight in his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he reread the state property code, section 209.006. A property owners association must provide written notice to an owner before the association can suspend an owner's right to use a common area, file a suit against an owner, charge an owner for property damage, or levy a fine for a violation of the restrictions. But it was the next section that really caught his attention. The law explicitly required a minimum 30-day notice period before an HOA could take any destructive action against a resident's property. Jake checked the date of the demolition against the HOA's notice. There had been no advance warning whatsoever. Energized by this discovery, Jake began digging deeper. He found case after case where homeowners had successfully sued their HOAs for similar violations. The precedent that particularly interested him was Martinez Lee, Oakwood Gardens HOA, where a homeowner won triple damages for improper removal of a greenhouse. Jake's research led him to the State Bar Association's website, where he found a specialized directory of property rights attorneys. As he scrolled through the listings, one name kept appearing in articles about successful HOA challenges: Sarah Chen, no relation to his neighbor Mary Chen. Taking a break from his research, Jake walked out to his backyard. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty space where his sauna had stood. The scattered debris had been cleared away, but the concrete pad remained, a constant reminder of the HOA's overreach. He returned to his dining room and continued his investigation, this time focusing on the Pine Grove HOA's own bylaws. Jake discovered something fascinating. The board's own rules required a formal hearing before any structural removal could be authorized. No such hearing had been held in his case. The more Jake read, the clearer it became that the HOA had violated not just state law, but their own procedures. He started organizing his findings into a detailed timeline. Day 1, sauna completed, fully permitted and inspected. Days 1 to 60, no complaints or violations issued. Day 61, sudden demolition without notice. Day 62, post-demolition notice received. Day 68, a HOA board meeting where no documentation of complaints could be produced. Jake's physical therapy patients noticed his fatigue during the day, but his research energized him. During lunch breaks, he made calls to various legal offices, taking detailed notes about their responses and fees. Several lawyers seemed interested in his case, but when he finally reached Sarah Chen's office, the conversation took a different turn. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said after hearing his story, "what the Pine Grove HOA did wasn't just procedurally wrong. It was a textbook example of HOA overreach. How soon can you come to my office?" Before scheduling the meeting, Jake made one final thorough review of his documentation. He discovered additional requirements in the state code about HOA board member training and certification. A quick public records search revealed that Victoria Winters and 2 other board members had failed to complete their required annual training. Jake also found an obscure regulation requiring HOAs to carry specific insurance coverage for actions taken against residents' property. If Pine Grove's policy had lapsed or was insufficient, it could add another layer to his case. The physical therapist in him understood the importance of proper documentation. He kept detailed records of every patient's progress. Now, that same attention to detail was proving invaluable in building his legal case. As Jake organized his findings into a coherent file for his meeting with Sarah Chen, he realized that his sleepless nights had unveiled more than just legal violations. He had discovered a pattern of arbitrary enforcement and procedural negligence that affected the entire community. With his research complete and his documentation organized, Jake finally allowed himself a full night's sleep. Tomorrow, he would meet with Sarah Chen, and the real fight would begin. The HOA board had no idea that their impulsive decision to bulldoze his sauna had led him to uncover their entire pattern of mismanagement and rule violations. Victoria Winters' reign of arbitrary enforcement was about to face its biggest challenge yet. Sarah Chen's law office occupied a modest suite in a professional building downtown. Jake arrived 15 minutes early for his appointment, carrying 2 thick binders of documentation. The office walls were lined with framed court decisions and certificates, but what caught Jake's attention was a local newspaper article with the headline, "Homeowner Rights Attorney Wins Landmark Case Against Predatory HOA." Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, greeted Jake with a firm handshake. Her reputation for taking on HOA abuse cases had made her something of a local legend among homeowners. As they sat down in her conference room, she immediately began reviewing his materials with the precision of a surgeon. "Jake," she said after 30 minutes of careful examination, "this is one of the most well-documented cases I've seen. Most homeowners don't keep such detailed records. She paused at a particular page, her eyebrows raising. And this video footage of the demolition, this is gold. Jake watched as Sarah methodically created separate piles of documents, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. She seemed particularly interested in the timeline he had created during his sleepless nights of research. "Let me walk you through what I'm seeing here," Sarah began, spreading out several key documents. "First, we have multiple violations of state law. The HOA failed to provide the mandatory 30-day notice. They didn't hold a required hearing. They took destructive action without proper documentation of violations." She moved to another stack of papers. "Then we have violations of their own bylaws. No formal complaint process was followed. No evidence of the alleged complaints exists. The board members failed to maintain their required certifications." Jake leaned forward as Sarah pulled out a legal reference book. "But here's where it gets interesting," she continued. "Under state law, HOA board members can be held personally liable for actions taken without proper authority. Victoria Winters signed the demolition order without board approval. That's a critical error." The discussion turned to strategy. Sarah explained that cases like this typically followed a predictable pattern. The HOA would first deny wrongdoing, then try to intimidate the homeowner with legal costs, and finally attempt to settle when they realized their position was untenable. "But we're not going to let them off easily," Sarah stated firmly. "This case isn't just about your sauna, it's about establishing consequences for HOA overreach. I've seen too many homeowners bullied into submission because they couldn't fight back." They spent the next hour outlining their approach. Sarah proposed a three-pronged strategy. First, they would file a detailed complaint demanding compensation for the destroyed sauna, including all related costs and emotional distress damages. Second, they would seek punitive damages based on the willful violation of state law and HOA procedures. Finally, they would petition for injunctive relief to prevent the HOA from taking similar actions against other homeowners. "We're not just building a case," Sarah explained. "We're building leverage. Every violation we document increases the pressure on their insurance company to settle. And believe me, their insurer won't be happy about covering deliberate violations of state law." Jake watched as Sarah made copies of his documents, carefully organizing them into a legal filing system. She pointed out specific statements from neighbors that would strengthen their case, particularly Mary Chen's testimony about witnessing the unauthorized demolition. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, pulling out a final document. "I've been tracking Victoria Winters. This isn't her first aggressive action as HOA president. I have records of 3 other homeowners who faced similar treatment but couldn't afford to fight back. We can use these patterns to establish a history of abuse." As their meeting concluded, Sarah handed Jake a retainer agreement. "You have a strong case, Jake. More importantly, you have the documentation to prove it. Victoria Winters and her board are about to learn a very expensive lesson about homeowner rights." Jake signed the agreement, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since finding his sauna destroyed, he felt confident about the path forward. Sarah Chen's reputation for winning against HOAs hadn't been exaggerated. She had already identified angles of attack he hadn't considered. Leaving the office, Jake realized this case had become about more than just his sauna. It was about standing up to HOA bullying and protecting his neighbors from similar treatment. The quiet physical therapist was about to become the catalyst for change in Pine Grove community, and Victoria Winters would never see it coming. The morning Sarah Chen filed the lawsuit against Pine Grove HOA, Jake Thompson was treating a patient when his phone started buzzing incessantly. News traveled fast in the community, and by lunchtime, the HOA board members had all received their formal legal notices. The lawsuit was comprehensive, running to 47 pages. It detailed every violation of state law, every breach of HOA procedures. Victoria Winters' reaction was swift and predictable. By mid-afternoon, every homeowner in Pine Grove received an emergency notice about frivolous legal actions threatening our community's financial stability. The notice warned of possible increases in HOA fees to cover legal expenses, a transparent attempt to turn neighbors against Jake. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Mary Chen organized an impromptu gathering of neighbors in her living room that evening. 23 homeowners attended, each with their own story of HOA intimidation. Someone suggested starting a legal defense fund to support Jake's case. By the end of the meeting, they had collected $5,000 and created a neighborhood action committee. That HOA's insurance company, Suburban Property Protection Loved, sent their own investigator the following week. The investigator, a methodical man named Robert Martinez, spent 3 days interviewing residents and reviewing documents. Jake noticed him paying particular attention to the video footage of the demolition and the board's lack of required certifications. Sarah Chen's prediction about the HOA's response proved accurate. Their first move was to file a motion to dismiss, claiming Jake had violated architectural guidelines. The motion was quickly denied when Sarah presented the complete documentation of permits and approvals. Then came the intimidation phase. The HOA's lawyers sent Jake a letter outlining the potential costs of prolonged litigation, suggesting he might lose his house if he persisted. Sarah's response was to add harassment charges to the lawsuit, increasing the potential damages by another $25,000. The turning point came during the discovery phase. Sarah Chen's request for HOA records revealed a pattern of selective enforcement and unauthorized actions. Victoria Winters had apparently been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, making decisions without board approval and keeping incomplete records. More damaging still was the email trail Sarah uncovered. Victoria had exchanged messages with the demolition company 2 weeks before Jake's sauna was destroyed, discussing the removal of an eyesore from the neighborhood. The emails proved premeditation and directly contradicted her claims about responding to resident complaints. The insurance company's lawyers requested a private meeting with Sarah and Jake. In the sleek conference room of their downtown office, they finally acknowledged the severity of the situation. That HOA's actions had exposed them to significant liability, and Victoria's unauthorized decisions had potentially voided their coverage. Mr. Thompson, the lead insurance attorney, said, "We're prepared to discuss settlement terms, but we need to know what it would take to resolve this without a trial." Sarah Chen was prepared. She presented a detailed settlement proposal that included not just monetary compensation, but structural changes to HOA governance. The insurance company representatives took notes, looking increasingly concerned about the potential costs. Meanwhile, the Neighborhood Action Committee had grown. Regular meetings were now attended by over 50 residents. They began reviewing years of HOA decisions, finding numerous instances of questionable actions. The committee started a newsletter, sharing updates about the case and educating homeowners about their rights. Victoria Winters' position became increasingly untenable. Other board members, worried about personal liability, began distancing themselves from her decisions. Tom Peterson, the retired accountant, resigned after discovering financial irregularities in the HOA's books. Jake continued his daily routine at the physical therapy clinic, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing tension in the community. His patients, many of them Pine Grove residents, offered constant support and updates about neighborhood reactions. The lawsuit had transformed from a simple property dispute into a referendum on HOA governance. Sarah Chen's careful legal strategy had exposed years of mismanagement and abuse of power. The insurance company's lawyers could see the writing on the wall. This case needed to be settled before it set precedents that could affect HOAs across the state. As autumn turned to winter, Jake received a call from Sarah Chen. The insurance company was ready to negotiate in earnest. Victory was within reach, but the final terms would reshape more than just Jake's backyard. They would change the entire community's future. The settlement conference took place in a large conference room at the regional courthouse on a cold December morning. Jake Thompson sat beside Sarah Chen, facing a team of insurance attorneys, HOA board members, and a visibly tense Victoria Winters. The mediator, Judge Michael Reynolds, had a reputation for handling complex property disputes. Sarah had prepared Jake for this day. Remember, she had told him, "They'll start low. Our strength is in the documentation and community support. Don't show emotion, no matter what they say." The insurance company's lead attorney, James Barrett, opened with their initial offer: $15,000 for the sauna replacement and $5,000 for legal fees. Sarah Chen didn't even bother writing it down. Instead, she began methodically presenting their evidence, starting with the video of the demolition. "Let's be clear about what we're looking at," Sarah said, playing the footage on the conference room screen. This shows a premeditated destruction of property worth $12,000, carried out without proper notice or authority. But more importantly, it demonstrates a pattern of abuse that has exposed the HOA to significant liability. Victoria Winters tried to interrupt, but Judge Reynolds silenced her with a raised hand. Sarah continued, laying out document after document. The email trail showing premeditation, the violated state laws, the lapsed board certifications, and statements from 28 residents describing similar incidents of HOA overreach. During the lunch break, Jake noticed the insurance company's lawyers huddled in intense discussion. When they returned, their demeanor had changed. Barrett presented a revised offer: $25,000 for the sauna, $15,000 for legal fees, and a written apology from the board. Sarah Chen smiled politely and pulled out another folder. Perhaps we should discuss the recent financial audit conducted by our Neighborhood Action Committee, she said, sliding copies across the table. Particularly these questionable expenditures approved without proper board oversight. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Victoria Winters' face had turned pale. The insurance company's lawyers quickly called for a private conference with their clients. When they returned an hour later, Barrett had a new proposal. We're prepared to offer $45,000 total compensation, including legal fees, he said. Plus, we'll agree to a complete revision of the HOA bylaws and immediate board elections. Sarah glanced at Jake, who gave a slight nod. They had discussed their minimum acceptable terms the night before. This was getting closer, but they weren't there yet. Let's talk about structural changes, Sarah responded. She outlined their requirements: mandatory training for all board members, a transparent complaint process, a requirement for multiple bids on all contracts, and an independent review board for property disputes. The negotiations continued into the evening. Judge Reynolds ordered dinner as both sides worked through the details. Victoria Winters left around 6 p.m., claiming illness, but everyone knew she saw the writing on the wall. Finally, near 9 p.m., they reached an agreement. The final settlement included $15,000 for a new sauna, $25,000 for legal fees and emotional distress, $10,000 to establish a homeowner education fund, complete revision of HOA bylaws, mandatory annual training for board members, creation of an independent review board, new election procedures requiring broader community representation, monthly financial transparency reports. The insurance company's lawyers looked exhausted but relieved. They knew the settlement, while expensive, was far less costly than a public trial that could set legal precedents affecting HOAs statewide. As Jake signed the final documents, he felt a complex mix of emotions. The victory was comprehensive, but it had changed him. The quiet physical therapist had become a community leader, someone who had stood up against injustice and won. Sarah Chen gathered their materials, looking satisfied. You know, she said quietly to Jake, cases like this usually end with just a check, but you've managed to create real change for your community. Outside the courthouse, the winter air was crisp and clear. Jake checked his phone to find dozens of messages from neighbors awaiting news. The settlement's non-disclosure agreement covered the financial terms, but the structural changes to the HOA would become public knowledge. As Jake drove home, he passed the empty spot where his sauna had stood. Soon, a new one would take its place. But more importantly, his community would have new protections against HOA overreach. The negotiations had achieved something far more valuable than monetary compensation. They had created a framework for fair and transparent community governance. Spring arrived in Pine Grove community with more than just new flowers. 4 months after the settlement, the neighborhood had transformed in ways few residents could have predicted. Jake Thompson stood in his backyard, admiring his newly completed cedar sauna, larger and even more beautiful than the original. But the sauna was just one visible change. That HOA itself had undergone a complete renovation. Victoria Winters had resigned shortly after the settlement, along with 2 other board members. The special election that followed brought fresh faces and new perspectives to community leadership. Jake, despite initial reluctance, had agreed to serve on the new independent review board. His experience made him particularly qualified to evaluate property disputes. Every Wednesday evening, he helped review resident proposals, ensuring everyone received fair treatment under the revised guidelines. Mary Chen, who had supported Jake from the beginning, now served as the HOA's president. Her first act was to implement the new transparency policies. Monthly financial reports were posted online, and all board meetings were streamed live for residents who couldn't attend in person. The Homeowner Education Fund, established through the settlement, had already sponsored 2 community workshops. Residents learned about their rights, proper HOA procedures, and the importance of community involvement. The workshops had unexpectedly become social events, bringing neighbors together who had barely spoken before. One sunny Saturday, Jake hosted an open house to celebrate the new sauna's completion. Dozens of neighbors attended, including several who had originally been skeptical of his legal fight. The gathering turned into an impromptu community meeting, with residents sharing ideas for neighborhood improvements. Sarah Chen made a special appearance at the celebration. She had become something of a local celebrity, now representing homeowners in similar cases across the state. What happened here in Pine Grove, she told the gathered residents, is becoming a model for other communities. You've shown that homeowners can stand up to unfair practices and create positive change. The impact of Jake's case reached beyond Pine Grove. Other HOAs in the region began voluntarily updating their policies, hoping to avoid similar conflicts. The state legislature even introduced a bill strengthening homeowner protections, with Jake invited to testify about his experience. The insurance company's prediction had come true. The case did set precedents, but in a way that benefited homeowners and HOAs alike. The new procedures actually reduced conflicts, as clear guidelines and transparent processes prevented most disputes from escalating. Jake's physical therapy practice had grown unexpectedly. His stance against injustice had earned him respect throughout the community, and many new patients cited his HOA fight as the reason they chose his clinic. He had to hire 2 additional therapists to handle the increased workload. 1 year after the demolition, Jake sat in his new sauna, reflecting on how much had changed. The cedar walls held the same comforting warmth as before, but now they represented something more, a community's ability to transform conflict into progress. The neighborhood newsletter's latest edition sat on his bench, featuring an article about Pine Grove's transformation. Property values had actually increased, contrary to Victoria Winter's dire predictions. The community's reputation for fair governance and resident involvement had made it more attractive to potential buyers. As steam rose from the hot rocks, Jake heard familiar voices outside. Mary Chen was showing a group of visitors from another HOA around the neighborhood, explaining their new governance model. Pine Grove had become a destination for community leaders seeking to reform their own associations. The final paragraph of the settlement agreement had required the HOA to install a small plaque in the community center. It read, "In dedication to fair governance and homeowner rights, established 2025. Few visitors realized the plaque's connection to a demolished sauna, but every Pine Grove resident knew the story." Jake's evening sauna sessions now held a different kind of peace. Beyond the physical relaxation, there was the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right can create lasting change. The steam carried away the memories of conflict, leaving behind a stronger community and a legacy of fairness that would benefit residents for years to come. The story of the bulldozed sauna had become part of Pine Grove's folklore, a reminder that positive change often starts with one person willing to stand up for their rights. In the end, Jake had gained much more than a new sauna. He had helped build a community where everyone's voice mattered.